Hey everyone, welcome back to You Are What You Love. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today's episode is part 2 of last week's conversation. If you haven't listened to part 1, be sure to head back to the last episode and catch up before starting this one. And what I think we've sort of walked ourselves to is the idea that perhaps on both sides there was good and evil in those characters.
Oh, yeah.
And I am curious, in your opinion, which type of evil is more detrimental? A character like Dumbledore, who can be believed to be the epitome of good and to build trust and to sort of walk you to your death over the course of 7 years. Or a character like Voldemort, who can be very clear about what he's looking for, very intense, and sort of say, you're either with me or you're against me,
Mm-hmm.
but is very clear in what with me means.
Yeah, I think Dumbledore.
Yeah.
I think Dumbledore by far and away. I also am bringing into this the fact that, I have been manipulated in my own life,
Mhm.
and B, am an educator.
Mhm.
And so I think, the emotional reaction of, how fucking dare you do this to a child? But even looking at, watching the Ministry of Magic encounter, "Hey, look, Dumbledore's back," and for a whole year not do anything, do exactly what they did, which got him into the war beforehand,
Mhm.
is, the insidiousness within the structures that are supposed to be fighting this larger black and white evil is what causes more harm on the other end. Because, if Lupin had job security through this whole time, maybe he and Thompson would have gotten together earlier and he'd been like, you know what? I do fully believe in this. I am going to go to the Battle of Hogwarts, but we just had a kid. We're going to hang back here because I don't feel the need to lay down my life all the time.
Mm.
We will never know
Yeah.
what that looks like, or if Sirius had been it's such a incorporated universe because of the way that fans have read into it and the way that we have made it within our own, that to me these are real questions to be
Yeah.
asking, like any good piece of writing, but really any good communal experience gives you.
Yeah.
Which is why we have a whole podcast about fandom.
Yes, exactly.
Why this happened.
Yeah.
And why I think fan fiction is such a beautiful art form, that we're not going to know which one was worse, just like you can't know in real life. But my own moral judgment as a person is the insidiousness within the structure harming those who it's supposed to be protecting is worse,
Yeah.
because you're lying.
Yeah. I think also the thing that comes to me with it
Mhm.
is that an evil on the side of Dumbledore, or the type of evil Dumbledore sort of represents,
Mhm.
is the evil that created the evil that we have in Voldemort. So
Mm.
without
Good
Dumbledore, there
connection.
is nothing that comes together to have to fight. And it's sort of what we were talking about, where we were saying it's easy for us when we were referring to our own Greek life
Mhm.
experience. It's easy for us as the people on the inside to say you wouldn't like being
Yeah.
here. It's harder to recognize, not that I think not getting a bit into a Greek organization is creating supervillains, but yeah, I mean, write in and prove me wrong.
I'm writing. What's bad experience?
By the way, I did
This
not
just
get
in
into
a date.
Zeta, and I am a villain now. No, but I think the thing about it is that Dumbledore represents an institution that excludes people.
Yes.
And Tom Riddle, despite having a ancestry of pureblood
Mhm.
background, when it comes to the magic, is and some of the terminology in Harry Potter is real on the nose. I'll put that out there, but
Yeah.
I know it's for children, but
Woo!
um,
I mean, we could have a whole episode on Kingsley Shacklebolt and Cho Chang. Oh boy.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
the
yeah.
reaction to Hermione and casting in the crystal. Anyway,
Yep. Yep.
racism.
It's
However,
everywhere.
but I think the point I was getting at is the idea that the Tom Riddle did have the qualities that should have allowed him to thrive in
Mhm.
this space. Then, because of his upbringing and current circumstance, was sort of put on the outside of it.
Yeah.
Then that is what manifests into him saying, well, the most important part of what we're talking about in our ideology is our heritage,
Yeah.
our actual bloodline.
Yeah.
Then for that to be, he's not given the attention he needs, he's not given the
Mhm.
support he needs, and then for that perversion of that idea to blossom.
Yeah.
I don't think you get that evil blossoming from a place, blossoming at all, if you don't have an institution upheld by someone like
Mm.
Dumbledore that says you are on the outside.
Oh, 100%. I also think it gets even more insidious than that because the reason that they give that Voldemort can never love is he was conceived under a love potion, which is that like his mother gave his father a love potion. That's how they fell in love. And like that's how he came about. Which then is like, if you want to draw a parallel to the real world, is that like if there's any form of coercion or clout, like just, perversion in whatever way you want to call it around like children who are born out of wedlock or whatever circumstances, they're inherently unlovable.
Yeah.
They're inherently not able to be loved. They're already broken
Yes.
when they get here. There's this already like, well, he was already broken because he
Mm.
was conceived under a love potion. So, okay, here he goes.
Mm.
Like, of course he's gonna do this now. And you see Dumbledore be like, I'm investigating him and I'm seeing if he's gonna do anything. He seems to be fine. But you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And there's a huge element of Harry Potter of disability doesn't exist
Mm.
in his world. And they're like of equating moral degradation with physical degradation, which is a huge ableist term that's really big in early English fantastical writings, like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R.
Mhm.
Tolkien. And she falls really heavily
Into that same
within
space.
that
Yeah.
same space of broadcasting villainy through noses, which also runs
Mm.
into anti-Semitism,
Mhm.
which is very rampant
Yeah.
throughout a lot of these books. So there's also that element within it too, which makes it doubly
Mm.
interwoven and awful.
Yeah, one of the things I actually think is interesting, and maybe this will be our transition to talk about the author of it all.
Mhm.
But one of the things I do think is interesting about Harry Potter in what it's trying to say and what it actually says is the more that you pull it apart, the
Mhm.
more the system and the metaphors sort of fall in on
Oh,
themselves.
100%.
And I do wonder if that's from someone trying to write this large moral statement who has a bit of a broken moral compass themselves. And so there's a level of, as you go through this, we say, okay, Dumbledore is the epitome of good and he's on
Mhm.
the right side, and being a part of
He's a
Dumbledore's
white
army is the right
robe and a
way.
white
And well, yeah, he is, he's played by Gandalf.
Well,
So
well, I mean, his well, probably not Gandalf, but his
um
first name is Lily Albus, meaning white.
right. And
Like
so you have this, but as we go through it, we start to pick apart the
Mhm.
idea that this character is the source of the ultimate evil that you're fighting. But I don't know that it was intended that way because,
No.
as I said, it's written from the perspective of someone who loves this character
Mhm.
and who never really reconciles that none of the pain Harry has gone through his entire life would be in existence if it weren't for this character that they also
Mhm.
idolize and view as the possibility of love for the first time in his life.
Yeah.
And
Ron's the possibility of love for the first time in his
mm,
life. The Weasleys are the
that's fair.
possibility of love for the
Or
first time
I
in his
think you know
life.
what I'm thinking of is more the idea of parental
Yes. Well,
of
Molly.
adult.
Well,
No?
no, because he encounters Dumbledore first. You're right.
Yeah, yeah,
You're
yeah.
right.
And also it's coming from the acceptance letter of the institution in which
Yes.
Dumbledore has
Yes.
done it, and also we know that Dumbledore is the one who, in theory, saved Harry
Yeah.
from life. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
guess
yeah.
that's sort of the perspective I'm coming from on that.
Yeah.
Where I do agree that the Weasleys are the actual possibility of
Yes.
love, whereas Dumbledore is the perceived possibility of love.
Bingo.
Um, but I think what we get from that, though, is that as we're pulling it apart and
Mhm.
saying, okay, this character is the person who actually is the sort of nexus point of all evil in
Mm.
Harry Potter, and also has grown themselves to be the person who can take down all evil. You've both created the evil and believe you're the
Trying
one
to
to end the
destroy it.
evil. What's interesting about that is that as we pull that apart and we start to find all of the things that don't work,
Mhm.
you look at the fact that perhaps the reason those things don't work out is sometimes I feel writers tell on themselves a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
And so as you start to pull that apart, you realize, okay, we're talking about taking down a character. The point of all evil in this book
Mhm.
is Voldemort.
Mhm.
And his desire is to purify the wizarding world and to remove to institute an extreme amount of sort of ethnic cleansing.
Mhm.
However, the system, the people who are trying to break, to defeat this person who wants to break down that system also are part of a system that has slavery, that
Yep.
has levels of classism where you can exclude
Classism,
people,
racism.
racism. it's very much inherent throughout the
Sexism.
entire
Oh
thing.
boy.
Right. And so you go through it and you say, okay, well, this book is about, or this book series is about good people defeating a terrorist, defeating a fascist. However, those people also have slaves.
Yeah. Except don't
Um,
worry, like, our favorite people don't have slaves because they're too poor and also they're muggle-born, so you're fine.
right.
You're good.
Right.
And he's an orphan, so he doesn't have one. It's
And
okay.
but everybody at school goes
Yeah.
through a system of house elves
Yep.
taking care of everybody.
Yep.
And on top of that, we then have these house elves who are slaves say, "No, no, no, I like it here."
Uh-huh. And there's some really incredible podcasts that break down this exact thing and
Yeah.
go really specific into it. So if you guys are interested in like any of this,
Yeah.
they like I know Potterless has done some, Harry
Mhm.
Potter and Sacred Text does definitely some, and Witch Please is really good at this.
Yeah.
And these are like scholars who study these systems who break it down.
Sure.
So it's in the discourse, and if
Yeah,
you're
yeah, I'm not making this
interested,
up.
yeah, if you're interested in this, I highly recommend looking those up because that's been really integral in my understanding of how do I still become a fan of Harry Potter when J.K. Rowling is as hateful as she is.
Yes, and so I guess my the thing that is very interesting to me
Mhm.
is not in this way that like, oh, we should have known, right?
Yeah.
It's all there. Because again, these were books for children,
Yeah.
and I think what strikes me is that if you now take J.K. Rowling's perspective and very
Mhm.
very vocal perspective
Yep.
of what she believes to be true and what she
Mhm.
believes to be her value system, and her very hateful rhetoric
Yeah.
across a number of things. I think currently like the conversation that we're having is about her anti-trans views, but those
Mhm.
are not the only views of hers that are problematic, and
Nope.
they're not the only views that she has been very vocal about.
No.
And so when you go back through the book and you look at it and you say, okay, I think also she wrote it down.
Yeah, that's, woof. One really fascinating thing to trace is, like, there's a lot of misogyny
Mm,
in the Harry Potter books. There's a lot of, like Fleur's characterization alone is, like, she's so pretty, and she has this ability to enchant men,
mhm,
and so she's inherently haughty and cold, and then she only becomes humanized when she still loves a man who's been bitten by a werewolf, who doesn't come from a family of a lot of money, and then she becomes the ideal wife because she's able to defend the homestead and like heal people when they come to her. She's been redeemed because her evil is being pretty. Or like just all the like we have to defend Jenny from all these things because she's the youngest of 7 and the only girl, but Jenny doesn't cry. And so she's an inherently relatable character because she's been through trauma as a woman, but she doesn't tell us anything about it. It's fine. Or the way that like you can't trust Rita Skeeter because she dresses in gaudish colors and has
mm,
big hands.
yeah.
She's so anti-trans coded.
Hmm.
It's bonkers.
Well, it's also the other thing that I think is interesting too about J.K. Rowling's interesting is definitely the wrong word. I
Mhm.
think perhaps the more frustrating might be the word I'm looking for. Version of this is that J.K. Rowling perceives herself as a feminist,
Yes.
and there's the whole term TERF is trans exclusionary radical feminist.
Mhm.
However, I think there's quite a bit of self-hatred in the idea of being a woman in general in the way that she speaks. And I think one of the best examples of that is the choice that
Mhm.
she made after writing Harry Potter
Mm.
was to write mystery novels under a pen name that
Mhm.
is a male pen name.
Yeah.
And arguably, she is one of the most famous female authors.
Mhm.
Her pen name, her name that she goes by is one when you first start with J.K. Rowling,
Mhm.
on paper you would not necessarily know that this was a woman
She
before
just
J.K. Rowling became as famous as
said that's what
possible.
she had to do.
Right. And I guess I guess also what bothers me though is that when you read the books, I think one of the things that really bothered me and perhaps possibly one of the things that never hooked me as a kid
Mhm.
trying to get into them was the fact that the female characters in the book are all quite annoying for me. Again,
Mhm.
I don't think that has to be everyone's experience, but for me personally, having read them as an older person and also
Mhm.
not necessarily relating to those characters as a child and
Yeah.
getting into the point where it pulled me in enough to read them. I didn't even
Yeah.
read them or see the movies. I think what bothered me reading them as an older reader, typically
Yeah.
for someone perceiving these novels, is that I found Hermione annoying as hell, grated on my nerves all the way through the books. I know
Mhm.
that is gonna get people to hate and whatever, and I know a lot of people related to her, but she was infuriating, but also I think infuriating because she was constantly trying and being put in this position where she was being ridiculed for being smart, but she
Mhm.
was also again that same energy of Gryffindor sort of looking down her nose. She was always making fun of Harry and Ron for not understanding and not
Yeah.
helping, not explaining in a way that was actually helpful. Was just irritated that they didn't know what they were doing. And then all of the other female characters, like you said, are either beautiful and wrong for being beautiful.
Yep.
They're beautiful and trophies for being beautiful when you have like a Cho Chang
Yeah.
situation, which is a whole other situation as I say her name.
Yeah.
And you also have the rest of the characters are mothers or teachers.
Yeah.
There is not a female character in that book that gets to be a powerful woman with no negative versions of
Ginny.
yeah.
Because she acts like a dude.
Well, that's what I was say. I don't even think that Jenny fits what I'm looking for, which is like I guess what's frustrating about it is you
You
get
need to
to
leave her?
watch these like teenage boys kind of or 11-year-old boys go through and they all have
Mhm.
personalities. Even the when you look at the Weasleys,
Yeah.
Ron is very clearly himself. You've got the twins are
Mhm.
funny.
Yeah.
They're enjoyable. They have all of these different even these like sort of stock characters have these enjoyable qualities to them that give them a
Mhm.
personality. And Jenny's personality is that she is not feminine.
Yeah. And she's a jock.
Yeah, she's not weak. She has
Yeah.
these fun, like, not like other
She's
girl
a cool
qualities,
girl.
and ultimately, that's the character that Harry ends up with.
Yeah, and then I love Ginny and Harry's relationship,
Mhm.
a lot, and I think, like, the writing of women in Harry Potter is problematic point blank, and problematic is, like, the least
This version
word
of
I
that word,
could
yeah.
use. However, I still find a lot of relatability and humanness in all of the women of Harry Potter. I never related to Hermione as a kid.
Mhm.
I was always Harry, when I read them, to the point where my mom was like, "Are you in love with him?" And I was like, "No, I am him."
Mm.
Like, this is who I feel as if I translate more. And then as I got older and some of the stuff that happened to Ginny happened to me, and I was like, "Oh, that's my coping mechanism." I have brothers. I
Mhm.
come from a family of a lot of dudes. But seeing the way that, like, 2 people, Harry and Ginny, who have gone through similar things, but are like, allow each other to break down was really moving. And this is where fandom is my favorite part of Harry
Yeah.
Potter, because the fan fiction that specifically exists around Ron and Hermione is gorgeous.
Yeah.
Some of, like, I've read 2 to 3 stories which have knocked me over,
Mhm.
like, in terms of their character, sentence construction, plot, just, like, stunning literature.
Well, and I think one of the things that's interesting about the Harry Potter fandom specifically,
Yeah.
having not been a part of it myself, but knowing how large it is
Mhm.
that it almost feels and I talked about this with Sequoia Simone
Mhm.
on an earlier episode when we talked about a Harry Potter musical. What's interesting is that as we're kind of talking about this idea of
Mhm.
who J.K. Rowling has revealed herself to be,
Yeah.
and also that now as you are both older,
Mhm.
experienced more, and are aware of what her views are,
Mhm.
you can find, unfortunately, a lot of that in the text itself.
Oh, yeah.
Something that I find really interesting about the Harry Potter fandom is that the response was sort of like, I don't know how much the original text matters anymore because we've built our own world out of these characters and out of the parts of these characters that we wish you would have continued exploring. So like what you're
Yeah.
talking about with Jenny and with Harry and that relationship and allowing them to sort of break down and go through those moments, a lot of that comes from fan fiction. A lot of that comes from the exploration of here's what was on the page, here are these characters, here's what's happened to them.
Mhm.
And now we're going to take that and go down the path of exploring the part that's the most interesting to us, which is fan fiction in general. That's not just Harry
Yeah.
Potter. And then you're talking about Ron and Hermione.
Mhm.
And I, as someone who was aware of the fandom, when I read the books, was surprised at how little exploration there is of some of these relationships, at how little Draco and Hermione specifically, knowing that what comes of that,
Yeah, it's,
they
that,
speak very infrequently for
yeah, exactly. This is, there's a lot of, fan fiction. I'm like, "Okay, cool.
right.
I understand where that's coming from, but, guys, Draco's not that's not where you wanna go."
But I guess what's interesting to me about that though is
Mhm.
that I feel like a lot of it, specifically with Harry Potter, again, I think this is a fandom practice in general, and I think
Yeah.
it's just heightened because of how the Harry Potter you sort of die a hero or grow old enough to watch yourself become the villain is the old
Yeah.
saying, right? So how Harry Potter has gone from being beloved and revered
Mhm.
to now saying we have to unpack what's going on here.
Yeah.
Something that then heightens a practice of fandom is taking parts of a book, and usually those are the parts that you see yourself in, and
Mm,
expanding what those characters are. So a lot
mm,
of the Draco behavior comes or reaction or desire to put him and Hermione together in that sort of enemies to lovers situation comes from the idea that I can't speak
mhm.
to every piece of Draco and Hermione fan fiction, but
There's
ultimately
a
the
lot.
practice of as someone who often finds myself relating to the
Mm,
villainized character and
mm.
engaging in those parts of fandom. Often I think that desire to then take a character who on paper, honestly, his interactions with Hermione, I don't want anyone to get mad at me, there's not a lot of romantic tension
No,
there.
they're inherently actually violent.
Yes,
There's
destructive.
destruction. There's also
There's
just like
physical violence as
yeah,
well.
no, yep.
There's verbal abuse, it's quite bad, but
There's
but
there's threats of death.
right, and also one powerful punch from Hermione that I feel is one of those moments that
I don't even know
people
if that's in
is
the
it I know it's in the
book.
movies, but I'm
I
not sure.
know,
I can't
but
remember if it's in
there's
the book or not.
my whole thing is his interactions at Malfoy Manor
Mm,
when
yes.
she's, almost tortured to
Yeah.
death and he doesn't do anything.
I
There's
think
that.
but I think where that fandom urge comes from, right, is for someone who perhaps sees the part of Draco that we were talking about earlier,
Mm,
where he sees people perceiving him as a child of privilege across the
mm,
board, not just from position of birth and position in class system, but a belief that this child is loved, that
mm,
this child is spoiled, and that they come from a loving household, and perhaps people who are able to look at that and say, actually, this isn't love, and I
mhm,
know what that feels like,
mhm.
are looking for a moment where they can say, "This character can break that cycle, can
Mhm,
break that feeling,
mhm.
and can love someone who is from the place that he's being told to hate." I think that's where
Yeah,
that desire comes from.
yeah,
Um, and I think do I think it's the right pairing? I don't know that I have a deep enough care for Harry Potter to have a stance on it, to be honest with
yeah.
you,
That's
or
really
for either
fair.
of those characters, but I do understand where that desire comes from, and I think
Yeah.
part of that is from people who feel like maybe Draco never gets that resolution or that full
Mm,
redemption that they're hoping for him to have,
mm.
because I think when you're looking at a piece of media like this, you have to recognize that people reading it are gonna relate to every different type of character
Oh, yeah.
there,
Oh,
and
yeah.
so I do wonder if part of the reason why the Harry Potter fandom has become so massive
Mhm,
is from the desire to sort of right these wrongs or to take these characters that aren't treated with as much care, to give them the background that they could have had if
mm,
treated with more care or
mm,
treated with different perspective. And if the fact that that was coming early on before we knew where J.K. Rowling stood
mhm,
comes from the fact that J.K. Rowling's views are inherently in the book. And so
mm,
there was a fandom desire to take this thing on the page and say, I think this character could have more out of life. I
mm,
think this character could break this cycle. I think this character could be less hateful and
mm.
could find love or could find this or
Yeah.
these two characters could work through their problems
Yeah.
together. I wonder if some of that I wonder if the fandom getting so big came from the fact that it was inherently flawed before we knew why.
I think that's probably part of it. I also think it came up when the internet was expanding,
Mm,
and it was the fandom that set what internet fandom would be
mhm,
and how it would happen, and that then, like, created that whole nexus of things, and then I think it's also a combination of, like, as we were uncovering as a society how to talk about a lot of these different oppressive structures in our everyday lives, as we were like, "Oh, we're gonna understand how, like, intersectionality of all things
mm,
was also the time when Harry Potter was growing as a fandom, so it was like intersectionality and Harry Potter were colliding
mm,
into 2 things. I do think you're right, though, but that there is an element of the book that once you have the language to look at it, you're like, "Holy crap."
right.
But it comes with having the language.
Yes.
And just like, maturation occurs, but I think, like because there are many problematic writers. There are many writers who have written beloved things who have been hateful people.
Mhm,
And what I think matters is how do you specifically form a relationship with that? Because I have many friends who are all Harry Potter fans who specifically are trans or non binary or queer, and every person has a different reaction to whether they don't read the books at all anymore, whether
Mhm.
they've written the whole thing off, whether they don't say literally or like just call the author, whether like the author has died, whether they just read fan fiction. It's so specific to each person and their individual like reckoning and relationship with it.
Mhm.
Just like I think it's so specific to understanding your own past as you grow up and figuring out like, how did I get here? Why did I get here? And how can I live more within the values that I have now
Mm.
as a person?
Mhm.
So my whole thing, I have my own personal ways that I interact with it. Like, I'm never gonna give her money again,
Sure.
and I'm never gonna, like, go to any of the parks, and I'm never gonna see any of the other movies, and I'm always gonna, like, buy the books secondhand if I ever have a friend who would like them. But I am gonna read them to my kids because I'm like, "Here's a way to learn
Mhm.
now what this looks like in text."
So based on what you just said, I just wanna clarify something. So when you're saying, "Here's a way to learn,
Mhm,
what this looks like in text now," do
mhm.
you mean here's a way to see some of the flaws and to recognize those flaws in text or
Yeah,
in ideology?
yes. So,
I think that's a really interesting
like,
perspective.
being like, I did not grow like, for example, I'm not Jewish, I did not grow up Jewish, but a
Mm.
lot of my friends and community is.
Mhm.
So, I was not aware of what the signalings of anti-Semitic language were within text
Mhm.
as a child.
Mhm.
I grew to understand what that was as I studied literature as I got older, and then reading the Green Got scene in the first book and being like, "Holy cow, they run a bank and they have exaggerated facial features and they're, like, very cold.
Mhm.
Holy crap."
Yeah.
Like, they speak a foreign language
Mhm.
that
Yeah,
only
all
they
very
understand and,
yes.
like, they have control over money. It was like, "Tick, tick, 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 tick," and I understood that once I had the way to, like once I had that reading language.
Yeah.
Or in the first book talking about Quirrell and, like, he goes off to the Orient, and then he came back and became sad, and it's like, "Oh, wow, he went and saw 9 white people and then came back and was scared, what?"
Mm.
Like, it's a really great way of encountering when in individual relationship and language of, like, "Hey, this isn't how we talk about a group of people." Or
Mm.
like, "Hey, let's think a little bit about this, like, parental relationship." Like, I recently told my nanny student out loud the entirety of the Harry Potter books from 0 page 1 to book 6, heavily edited.
Yeah.
But he would often be like, "Well, why haven't they gone to an adult?"
Right.
He'd be like,
That's what I'm
Yeah,
asking.
he was like, "Go ask an adult." And I was like, "I love that this is your reaction."
Mm.
Because it means that it's working. Like, you are knowing that in this situation, it's not up to you to solve it, up to you to go and find somebody
What's
else.
interesting about what you're talking about is I think a lot of the conversation around Harry Potter right now
Mhm.
has become, are we still able to engage with this
Yes.
text?
Yes.
And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that it is so beloved and hit so many people at such a young age.
Well, the other thing is it so created an environment for queer people to find themselves
Mm.
because it was like a whole bunch of outcasts one in one another when we were the generation that was before marriage equality.
Mm.
And so a large portion of the fandom is queer,
Yes.
and that is exactly who she's attacking.
Right.
And so it's like literally like front in attacking most forwardly.
Mhm.
And so I think like that I think is another reason why it's such a big reckoning is it's like you don't even know who grew up with this.
Yeah.
It's the very people you say you hate.
Right. I think the thing that's interesting about your perspective is I think a lot of the conversation is sort of, yes, I'm going to do it and I don't care about who it
Mhm.
affects, which is one camp that people have
Mhm.
been talking about. Not necessarily a camp I would say I agree with, but that's my own personal opinion. Then
Attacking
there's
like in terms of the property itself, it's like I don't care like what she says. I'm just
yeah,
going to do it anyway.
yeah, meaning like I'm
Mm.
buying the video game, I'm playing, it doesn't
Oh
affect
yeah.
me, I don't care.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna keep going to the parks, I'm gonna keep doing this, I'm gonna keep doing that, and I'm mad that you're asking me to stop.
Yep.
There's that camp, which is one extreme, and you have the other camp, which and there are what I'm getting at is there are camps in between, which is what
Mhm.
we're discussing.
Yeah.
But the other camp is Harry Potter's dead to me.
Mhm.
I cannot speak of it again. I don't want anyone to speak of it again.
Mhm.
Every time you talk, you give her money and all of that. And then there's the version sort of in between, which I think one of the interesting parts of what you're talking about
Mhm.
is this is sort of a part of my DNA.
Yeah.
This is something that I read and I care for and taught me a lot about myself,
Mhm.
taught an entire generation a lot of things about themselves. And something that you're hitting at that I think is really interesting and that I wish not just from the J.K. Rowling side of
Mhm.
things and the Harry Potter side of things, but in general, something that you're talking about is going back and looking at media that you looked at as a child before you got outside of your own bubble
Yeah.
of things, and looking back at the things that you didn't notice,
Mhm.
you didn't understand, and were to some degree being coded of again,
Yeah.
and decoding that, and then looking for ways to, in your next generation of
Mhm.
your own children, teach them that these are bad signs that are not the same pure good and evil clear
Mhm.
cut answers. This is bad, this is good, and this is
Mhm.
why. You're looking at the Dumbledore of it all that we're talking
Mhm.
about, which is a beloved person who is perhaps manipulating you in a way that is harder to understand.
Yeah.
And I think there's something interesting in that, in being able to look back at Harry Potter and disconnecting your nostalgia from it
Mhm.
enough that you can look at it, because I think a lot of people are not willing, and I can't speak for everyone again,
Mhm.
because I again am looking at this from an outsider perspective, and I have that ability to
Mhm.
do so of not having that nostalgia myself.
Yeah.
But I think if you are willing to disconnect your nostalgia and look back at the text itself,
Mhm.
you can find the parts of the text that say the things that you don't want to hear about the author itself.
And I think also, like, every Harry Potter fan that I know has been like, "I'm making my own personal reckoning
Mm,
with what this means to me."
mhm.
And I've got I don't have anyone who's like, "I don't care, I'm just gonna continue doing
Right.
my own thing."
Yeah.
I have everyone who's done everything from, like, "I'm never gonna engage in it again," to, "I work at the park, but I don't have and I have a very specific relationship to it, and that's what I have figured out on my
Mhm.
own." Like,
Mhm.
I'm a queer person who works at this park, but I figured out a way to, like, strike a middle
Middle
between that,
ground.
you
Right.
know?
Mhm.
And I think one of the parts of being an adult is being like, "Okay, what from what I learned about how the world works and what I was taught was good and right, do I wanna carry through? And what do I understand there's more levels to? And what do I wanna expand in?"
Mm.
I think another thing that this reading of Harry Potter is given is like how to investigate all these characters who are in and around our main three
Mhm.
and even deeper into our main three.
Mhm.
And so at the same time understanding that Dumbledore is a master manipulator, looking at the bravery of Arthur Weasley and Neville Longbottom,
Mhm.
looking at the way that Fleur was put into some really uncompromising positions, looking at Cho Chang and her name,
Mhm.
like, looking at, like, Angelina Johnson and Katie Bell and, like, being a female athlete within this world. There's a lot that you can unpack
Mhm.
as a things, and then the best part about, like, fan fiction is being like, "Okay, who's gay?"
Mhm.
Going in and being like, "Let's go. Where is it? Let's find it."
I
Um
You know what I'm interested in though, and I do wanna put a button on as
Mhm,
well, because I think it's a really good perspective to have, is that one of the things that seems like you've worked out in your own
mhm,
personal relationship with it as a queer woman, as a
mhm.
woman who does not align with most of these views, all of these
All
views,
of these views.
not to speak for you, but I feel,
No, 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 all
um
of them.
uh, it sounds like part of your personal relationship that you've come to is that not only do I recognize the problems,
Mhm,
not only do I very much not want to support this person
mhm,
anymore, but also you're looking at it from a perspective of, I also missed this about this person and this
mhm.
text. And now I can use this as a way to go back through and recognize the less obvious, more manipulative
Yeah,
ways that someone of those views or of these places can infect those views and put them out there in a way that
mhm,
becomes dangerous,
mhm.
because it is not the clear Voldemort, this is evil
Yeah.
way. And I think that's an interesting perspective to take, which is sort of taking a step back and saying, as someone who doesn't share any of these views, how did I miss this? And then go back and say, well, I don't want to miss it again.
Yeah, exactly, and
Yeah.
then being able to use it to be like, "I missed it the first go around because I didn't have any of the terminology, I was a kid
Hmm.
reading a book
Hmm.
in my bubble," as you said, and then being like, "Okay, great. When I pass this on, I'm gonna pass it on with the knowledge I have now."
Hmm.
And being able to look at it like the way that I told the story to my student is that Sirius and Lupin were in love
Hmm.
and that like they were in love the whole time. And when he like, loses Sirius, he's like, "Well, he has his other godfather." And I was like, he goes, "Lupin." And I went, "Yes, he does. Yes, he does." And being able to, infuse that within it while at the same time being like, "Hey, cool. You're 11 and you're going to know what transphobic language looks like right now.
Mm.
So that when you're 15, you can call it out
Yeah.
in front of you. You can call it out with your friends
Mhm.
because, in a beautiful way, she's given us a shared language to say F you to what she thinks
Yeah.
and
I
being able to call it right there.
and sometimes I think that is one of the best ways to look at something is to say, "How can we stop this from ever happening again?"
Yeah.
We can use what you put out
Mhm.
as a tool to teach people this is what hate looks like.
Yep.
I think it's interesting because I think it allows people to move through the world in a way that allows you to say, "Here are the good things I learned about love, and
Mhm.
here are the things that I missed about hate, and here's how I can move forward with more love and recognize hate before it becomes dangerous."
Bingo.
I think that's a really well-rounded way of trying to move through your
Mhm.
relationship with it. So I think that's interesting. I think also something that I am curious about
Mhm.
is we've brought up Sirius, and this will take us, I guess, sort of sort of through J.K. Rowling's views, but also back into the book a little bit and
Mhm.
back into the text, which is that Sirius in particular is someone who you mentioned
Mhm.
earlier is a version of Draco, has the
Mhm.
same sort of background as Draco, but rejects it much earlier. And we see that in book 5 when he is sort of moving through this house, his childhood home, and
Mhm.
the imagery of hatred that his parents have left behind.
Mhm.
And there's you might have to correct me on anything that I'm wrong
Yeah.
on, but I do remember there being I think it was the portrait of his mother or the portrait
Mhm.
of his parents that are still spouting hate
His mother,
after
yeah.
death. Yeah, his mother,
Mhm.
and how he can't get rid of that image.
Magicked to the
Magic to
wall.
the wall, right? And so she's sort of left her legacy of
Mhm.
hatred as she speaks down on these people that he has made his family out of coming into the
Mhm.
house. And you see this sort of generational hate that is not leaving.
Yeah.
In a quite literal sense,
Yeah.
you're seeing that. And then also, unfortunately, that character is who is rejecting it is the
Mhm.
character who dies.
And his younger brother, who's instrumental in the defeating of Voldemort, because he's the first one to find the Horcrux.
Mhm.
He's RAB. He rejected it as a Death Eater at 19. He's also killed.
Yes.
And Sirius dies not knowing how his younger brother died,
Mm.
not knowing that they were making the same decision at the same time.
Mhm.
But because his younger brother had not formally left the family and Sirius had been excommunicated, they had no way to communicate between the two of them,
Mhm.
which is just awful.
It is awful. It is heartbreaking. And what I remember is when I was reading that is it felt like there was a level of a message of characters who were trying to break the cycle and break the
Mhm.
system, not only dying but not being able to be happy
Yeah.
either. Not being given happiness, not being given a moment of peace. And I wondered almost if that struck you, I don't know necessarily on your first read or maybe on your adult look back on it as an idea of a class system not being able to fully ever be demolished and those who step out of it,
Mm.
because we talked about earlier when we were talking about the point system, we talk about
Mhm.
how the rubies are strewn out and it's never implemented again.
Mhm.
However, we don't see a dismantling of the house elf
Yep.
system. We don't see a dismantling of werewolves being unable to work. We don't see this
Later
room
in what she says
later. Sure,
Hermione does, but okay.
sure. But we don't see this sort of. I mean, it to me, after you defeat Voldemort,
Mhm.
there should be a reckoning of this system. The same reckoning
Yes.
that we, the same reckoning we talked about not happening when Voldemort comes to power the first time.
Mhm.
And the characters that we do see that are part of growing up in that generational problem. So Sirius, Draco, I wouldn't say
Tonks. Tonks is
mm,
Sirius's cousin,
mhm,
and her sister Andromeda left the family, is excommunicated, marries a muggle,
mhm,
and then we see Tonks not only bucking gender norms
mhm.
because she, like, dyes her hair and decides to become an Auror, which is a cop. That's a whole other conversation. But she's also excommunicated, and Tonks then is never happy because she's with Lupin, who's a werewolf,
Mhm.
and they can never have a moment of peace for what they think is his like his identity, for lack of a better word, and then they're both killed, elevating them from the like outcast to martyr.
Murder, right.
So it's every person involved within the Black family.
Yeah, and I thought what was interesting about that is the characters, like you did mention specifically, like Hermione is the one who goes on to be able to make some of those changes.
Mhm.
The characters who are actually raised within the system
Mhm.
and benefited from the system in some ways. You see this again also with Tom Riddle from the idea of pureblood
Legacy?
heritage legacy.
Yeah.
Um, you don't see those characters who choose to leave the system either one, break the system,
Mhm.
or two, achieve happiness.
Yeah, which is, why one of my favorite podcasts, they talk about how the, promise of the 7th book falls on its head
Mm,
because it's, like, all about redemption, and they don't actually change what the world is.
yeah,
And so,
and
like, the way to actually do that is if Harry stays dead.
interesting.
And is like, if you're looking at it from, like, a savior complex,
Sure.
like a religiosity way of thinking about it, but, like, the way to actually move into this new world is if you chuck a lot of this system. But it's a book that promises revolution that doesn't give you one.
I wonder though, I wonder if that is as negative as this is gonna sound or as
Mhm.
pessimistic as this is going to sound, a more realistic view of actual revolution.
Well, I think that's it,
Yeah,
actually. I think that's it.
yeah. Because I think the problem that it really comes down to
Mhm.
is the people who are they're attempting to dismantle the system benefit from the system as well. And so
Yeah.
they are not willing to fully dismantle the system because when you get to the point of, okay, we have come back into power,
Mhm.
we have the reins again. The question is, does any human being ever have the ability to sit down in the seat of power and not be, as Dumbledore said, entranced by
Yeah. Yeah.
it?
That is the essential question.
Again, it's one of those sort of darker elements of a children's story, but I don't know that it offers a sense of hope by the end.
Yeah, I also think, like, the thing with children's stories is that they have a different way of illuminating darkness, but the darkness is still there because 'cause they're human.
Mm,
Like, never forget that a child is a human being and that they often see things fundamentally because they haven't learned exactly all the other stuff around it,
mhm,
or they see it out of context because they haven't learned all the other stuff around it.
mm,
So, I think one of the reasons why we resonate so deeply with children's stories is because it emotionally communicates what darkness means.
mm,
And when I will speak from my own experience, like trying to figure out how to put that to words as a young child, being very empathetic, deeply feeling, but also just like aware
yeah,
of things,
mhm,
and being able to have the privilege of living in a home environment where like things were stable enough for me to be able to not have to fight that off like on this day, but I was just learning about the wider world.
mhm,
I think children's stories give us the best way into human darkness a lot of the time.
mm.
We learn how to examine it as we get older and in adult stories, I think. But I think we first learn when we're young. Grimm's fairy tales wrote them weird for a reason.
Yeah, the Grimms are a wonderful example of that actually because someone who apparently knows a lot of information about the Grimm brothers, they were in a place of privilege until their father died. And they then have to, I'm talking about the actual Grimm brothers, not the fairy
Hmm.
tale. They then went from that place of privilege to a place of poverty to some degree with a single mother of children at the time. And a lot of that darkness in those fairy tales comes from experiencing darkness as a child and needing to push it out
Yeah.
into something else that you can understand, which is something that's larger and fairy tale-esque. And I think that's interesting. One of the things that I think is interesting too, though, is that I would say one of the things that you touched on that is quite meaningful, I think, is the idea that you were processing evil before having experienced it yourself. And I think there are sort of 2 camps of childhood, right? You you sometimes get to have a very peaceful one, and you sometimes have a very chaotic one, and so either way, you are preparing for evil before you're necessarily ready.
Yeah.
And so for some people, they are processing trauma at a young age before they
Yes.
understand what that word is and what that
Yeah.
means. And for some people, they are learning what it is and getting the language for it so that they can process it later. I am curious if you were attracted to those types of stories outside of Harry Potter because I think a couple that stick out to me that are similar in terms of child in tragic situation or heightened situation are the Spiderwick Chronicles
Yeah, love
and
them.
the Lemony Snicket's series of unfortunate
Loved
events.
them.
So you were attracted to that idea of
Yeah.
sort of chaos, even though
Yeah,
you weren't experiencing it yourself.
no. I also, though, had 7 surgery before I was 5
Mm,
and had a whole medical history I had no memory of
okay.
that impacted the way that emotionally my family dealt with me as a kid.
Okay.
And so I then wouldn't tell people when I was in trouble
Mm.
or was feeling inward, which is classic oldest girl raised in the South behavior because you're like taking care of everyone else. And I'm just, as in like last week, beginning to understand how this has like made an impact on my life. But the way of like in these darker situations, also, I was a writer and an actor. I was an actor. I
Mhm.
was attracted to like drama and story and what that gave us about the world from a very, very young age.
Yeah.
Heck, I was raised Episcopalian. We read the Bible. There's a lot that happens in there. You know, like, and so I was already attracted to stories that explored this level of, for lack of a better word, darkness because I was very curious about human expression in the world because, as you said, I was like processing trauma before I ever experienced it myself,
Mhm.
but also learning upon reflection, oh, wait, maybe I have lived a tiny bit of this,
Mm.
but I just don't remember it.
Well, I was gonna say, it actually sounds like despite the fact that you lived in a loving home, that's not
Mhm.
the only type of trauma, and not necessarily remembering, but have your body does, so they say, "Keep the score," quote,
Yeah.
unquote. Your body remembers that something bad happened,
Something
and
just I like the was different, I think,
yeah.
because I don't wanna like
Not bad.
medical
Medically,
conditions aren't
yeah,
bad,
not
they're
necessarily
just
bad, but
hard.
I suppose, the word I'm looking for and you're right, it's not bad, it's a condition, but I mean,
Mhm.
the in the sense of, surgery being traumatic, of
Mhm.
experiencing that, but also something that you touched on that I think is interesting in it because it comes from a place of love, and I wonder if it
Mhm.
has something to do with your read of Draco, where and
Mhm.
our reads being very different
Mhm.
is that your family you did not remember the cause of it, but you did recognize that your family treated you in a specific way.
Yeah, when I was sick, I definitely recognized that my family it was triggering to the adults around me to see me in that space
Mhm,
because they had seen me. Because I also hello world, maybe one of you will have this. I have something called vascular malformations. They're
mhm,
1 in 50,000 people.
okay,
They're completely harmless except when they cause you pain after, like, swelling. It's a buildup of excess red blood cells. But when I was first diagnosed with them, we had no idea what they were.
mm,
The science did not exist. Now you go to LA Children's or Boston Children's and they have a radiology department. There's people there who know what's going on. When the early 2000s, they had no clue.
mm,
So I was told I had leukemia. We were told I had elephant's man disease. We were told I had, they had no idea.
yeah,
So they were doing surgeries to be like, I think this will work, but we're not entirely sure. And then it didn't. And my parents were like, this isn't doing anything. So should we stop?
mm,
And my doctor was like, yeah, 100%. So that's what we did. And then, that more of them developed during puberty as it's supposed to do, but that then stopped. So I think like my life was only really ever in danger when I had RSV as an infant and had open heart surgery as an infant.
mhm,
Other than that, it just was hard,
sure,
as a
sure,
thing. And I'm very grateful for that. Not a lot
mhm,
of kids who have this medical history can say the same thing. But the emotional reaction my parents had, I sensed. And we've talked about this a little,
mhm,
but like not, its entirety. But especially when I had heart surgery at 8 months old in an adult hospital, because the children's hospital wasn't built in Nashville yet. And I was recovering in a ward of all these like 55-year-old heart attack victims who were
sure,
all adults. Like, that was an incredibly emotional and traumatic experience for my parents
right,
and for my family. And so, as a young person, when I would get sick, I would notice them tense.
mm,
And I'd be like, okay, it's my job as the oldest to take care of everyone at all times. I will minimize everything.
mm,
And my parents noticed and they were like, hmm, okay. And that was a pattern that has continued until I was an adult. And we've been able to unpack this all together. But I think that's one of the reasons why I related to these stories of these children in these moments, because I was like, oh, I know how to take care of other people and minimize my own suffering.
mhm,
Also, within the Judeo Christian way of looking at the world, like when you sacrifice yourself for others, you are living more within the realm of Christ. And so I was like, cool, this is also the good thing to do, TM.
sure.
I was 6. Like, this is, like I'm trying to uncover, like, my thinking from 6 to because this is really 6 to 10 and 11,
Yeah.
and then I had friends who were like, "MF, if you broke an arm, we would not know.
Yeah.
Like, you have to let us know when you fall down."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "No, I'm fine." And they're like, "No, no, no, you fell down." And then I had teachers who were like, "You can ask for help." And my parents were like, "You can ask for help." And that's been a method over my life to
Sure.
understand how to ask for
Yeah,
help.
and what's interesting is tying it back to parts that I've listened to you talk about with Harry Potter
Yeah.
is that the parts that you actually view as things that were bad
Mhm.
instilled in these characters are some of the things that you're talking about with your own self and the way that you view things, which
Mhm.
is this idea of bodily sacrifice,
Yep.
this idea of raising young men to be soldiers, and that characters like Neville who go
Mhm.
from being not necessarily hardened or willing to put themselves in harm's way, being given value by getting to that point.
Yeah.
Um, it's just interesting that you related to Harry at the time when you were doing the same thing, and now as you're processing your sort of own view
Yeah.
of not doing that to yourself, and also processing the harm that it caused these characters to be told that that's the way to move forward.
Yeah.
There's an interesting unpacking of both, I think, at the same time.
Yeah, and I think, like, that's the reason why I resonate with Harry so much,
Mm,
is because I was, like, watching him in that moment in time, um, and the way that he loved others so unconditionally around him, and
mhm.
then why as I've gotten older, I resonate with Ginny so much.
Interesting. Do you feel like the idea, like the tension you talk about with your parents being worried every time you were sick,
Mhm,
and obviously them remembering something you don't remember,
mhm.
and this you have since learned that the condition that you were born with is not as deadly as it was
It was
previously
never
believed.
supposed to be
Never
deadly, it
should
was
have been.
just it w my life was never in danger, it was
Mm,
more the fact of, like, we don't know what this
that's
is.
wrong, right?
Like, there was just no information
Right,
whatsoever.
sure. But from your parents' perspective at the time,
Mhm,
an 8-month-old having open heart surgery
mhm.
is, I'm sure, viewed as a life or death situation that
Yes,
they have to process.
yes.
And that's something that they're going to always have in their
Mhm,
in their core DNA. I don't know that
mhm.
that's something that you can get out,
No, both my brothers also had health issues too,
mm,
so they didn't get to escape it after
escape it,
me. It
yeah.
was wink.
Right. Um, but it's something that you don't remember at all, and
Nope.
it's something that the adults around you remember and react to.
Mhm,
That is very similar to Harry's sort of beginning and story
mhm,
throughout. And you have sort of everyone in a heightened way. It doesn't sound like this
mhm.
was your entire childhood, but in a
No.
very heightened way, Harry's entire identity
Yeah,
is this thing that happened to him that he doesn't remember, that he is physically scarred from, and I would
yeah,
assume from having open heart surgery, you also have a scar of some sort. I'm looking
yeah,
at it right now.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but he then is both given value and negative connotations
Mhm,
from that physical manifestation of the thing that he went through as a child, and the time he sort of cheated death, so to speak.
mhm,
And he also is never told explicitly until you get to the point of the 7th book, but in his one parental views character parental type character,
mhm,
in Dumbledore, not in Mary and I mean, not in Molly and
mhm.
in, Arthur,
Arthur.
but in Dumbledore, there's also a view that he is doomed for death
Mm,
ultimately as well.
mm,
I wonder how much of that connected to something that you didn't necessarily understand as a child reading these books
mm.
of that mark of something you don't remember, of a physical, approach of death, and the fact that everyone around you remembers it and isn't saying it necessarily.
Yeah, I think that definitely resonated, but there was also, like I was very much assured that I was never gonna die.
Yeah.
Like, there was nothing here that was like, "My life is going to die."
Mhm.
But there was a pedestaling of, like, "You're so kind, and you're so caring, and all that kind of thing, and you take care of others so well," which is much more being the eldest woman in the South,
Mm.
that also contributed to this minimizing, so it was, like, both of those 2 things at the same time
Mhm.
coming together. But I do like and then also I was told, "You're so smart and you're so you're so intelligent and you're so driven. You're gonna do amazing things."
Mm.
So, I was getting the chosen one narrative as a kid
Mm.
because I was like, "You've been marked by something that you don't remember, and you're gonna do an amazing thing, and also, you don't fit in because you don't learn the same way everyone else does."
Right.
So I had all 3 of those things in a nexus, And then you talk of the fact I had brothers and mostly had, like, guy friends when I was younger, because who else was in the pull-out classes?
Mhm.
I'm talking, like, 4 to 7.
Mhm.
Then after that, my whole friend group gets very I mean, I always had girlfriends, but, like, then it gets really diversified and goes more girl. That's a whole other thing. But for those when I was encountering Harry Potter for the first time, Harry, I was like, "Oh, I get that. I was never really, like, super good at school, so I'm not gonna get Hermione." I get Hermione now
Yeah,
as an adult all
sure.
the time,
Mhm.
and I relate to her more as an adult in my world now than I ever did as a kid. But, yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's exactly why I ended up as Harry.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've put quite a bit of a button on almost every topic, and we could have kept talking for another 2 hours,
I
I'm
know.
sure. It's an ambitious attack of trying to do all 7 books, an entire franchise, and the problems that come with it,
Woo!
in one sitting.
Look at us
Um,
go.
but but I think we've come to a lot of different parts of both what the book meant,
Mhm,
what fandom has built out of it, what your own personal connection was, and maybe finding those moments that you don't necessarily think of
mhm,
as connecting to something early on. I think there's the idea of sort of being a child in danger and
mhm,
being a person who can step outside of that and
mhm.
keep everyone safe. And there are so many other things we could have talked about,
So many.
but I've really enjoyed the path our conversation has gone down,
Yeah, me
and I've
too.
enjoyed it. So I'm gonna ask you our last question because if
Great,
I don't, we will sit here for another 4 hours and
great.
keep going.
I love it.
Um, so the question I have for you, which I ask
Mhm,
everyone, is if
mhm.
you had never read Harry Potter, what would be different about you today?
I don't think I'd be an actor.
Not at all?
No, I mean, I think I would have found acting later,
Mm,
um, because Harry Potter gave me the space to create a whole world in my room
mm,
with other people where I was, like, writing the thing as I was acting, as I was moving through.
mhm.
Um And I don't know if I would be have the same best friendships that I, like, had from childhood, specifically with my friend Sophia. "Hi, you're gonna love this. I'm gonna send this to you." In that way, but I think maybe I'd become a writer first
Mm,
instead of an actor first. I don't know.
interesting.
I also definitely would have, like, struggled to find a book series that really would have hooked me in the same way in reading until I think Percy Jackson. So I'd have had, like, 6 years
Yeah.
where I would have been who knows? Maybe I'd have become into soccer. Well, I'm not coordinated, so I'm coordinated in other ways, but want me to I'm not non-athletic, but I'm not athletic like a soccer player, despite being a queer woman. Yeah. So I
Do
think
you
that's the main
think
thing.
you would have I think one of the big things that or two of the big things that we talked about
Mhm.
today were fandom reaction and learning how to process disappointment
Yeah.
and coded language. Do you think you would have found the same the same inclination or motivation to unpack those indicators or to find that language yourself, um, to navigate your relationship with that?
Yeah, because I studied gender and
Mhm,
sexuality in college, and I've always been interested in, like, the tiny things that lead up to hateful messages
mhm,
in order to try to understand where that comes from. And, we read To Kill a Mockingbird and Faulkner and in high school, which are about understanding, like, certain coded messages, and Faulkner is another example of what do you do with the author. So I think I would have gotten there just later. I
mm,
think there would have been a lot of stuff in my life that got delayed,
yeah.
if that makes any
Yeah, yeah,
sense.
yeah. Um, and do you think you would have found the same communal aspect of it though? Because I don't know that so many people are
No.
out there writing fan fiction about Faulkner.
No. No,
Someone is,
I
but
think, like, again, I think, like, if I had read Percy Jackson, I would have come into the communal then,
mm,
and then when Stranger Things hit, I would have gone, like, hardcore
mhm,
into it, and that would have been when I was, like, in
yeah,
college.
much later.
So, that, like, a whole thing. Who knows? Maybe I'd have gotten into well, I was into Supernatural at the end, so I'll classify.
All right. Well,
That's a whole other one.
that's a whole other one. Whole other situation. Well, thank you very much for
Yeah.
joining me and tackling this one, because as I said at the beginning, it's one that I've known we needed to get to, but
Yeah.
been nervous of how to approach it. So I do feel like hopefully, and everyone else listening hopefully feels like we did it justice as
Mhm.
both the fandom and the impact that it's had, but also the navigating the situation of what exists now
Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining me with that.
Of course. I loved it. I love conversations like this. So I feel very honored to be asked.
Well, I had a wonderful time
Me too.
sorting through this one with you. Between now and next Wednesday, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow me on social media at Marissa Kamari, anywhere you get your social media fix. You can also sign up for my newsletter by going to our website, tandonproductions.com, clicking on You Are What You Love, and signing up there. I send out an issue with every episode of this podcast. And we just started a Discord server, so if you want to connect with me, with other listeners, and talk about the types of things that we are talking about on this show, you can join that by clicking on the link in the episode description. Until next Wednesday, I hope you are enjoying what you love.